The seats were empty again. Drethani stood at the center of the Galactic Council chamber on Valeth Prime, all four of his glass-thin hands resting on the Arbiter's podium, and stared at the human delegation's row. 11 days now. 11 days of those 5 chairs sitting there like pulled teeth. The console screens dark, the translation earpieces lined up in their charging cradles where Maggie Dunn had left them. She always left them crooked. They were still crooked. Nobody had straightened them. Nobody had thought to. Around him the chamber hummed with the low, overlapping frequencies of 12 species trying to conduct business, as though a 13th hadn't simply vanished. The Salvari ambassador, a sleek silver-furred creature named Kriel, who moved like something that had once hunted in packs and never fully forgot how, leaned toward the Rithkai delegate and said something that made his neck frills ripple with amusement. Drethani caught the tail end of it. Something about children holding their breath. He did not find it funny. 400 years he had held the gavel seat. He had mediated territorial wars between species that communicated through chemical clouds. He had brokered resource treaties with civilizations that considered linear time a philosophical choice. He had seen empires dissolve and reform and dissolve again, and through all of it, the Council endured, because every species, no matter how strange or stubborn or new, understood one fundamental truth. You show up, you sit in the chair, you talk. Even when the talking was useless, even when every delegate in the room knew the words were theater, you showed up because the showing up was the point. Presence was the treaty. Absence was the only real act of war the Council recognized. And the humans had committed it without firing a shot. He convened a closed session that afternoon. 12 delegations packed into the sealed inner chamber, the air thick with competing atmospheres, and the faint electric smell of universal translators working overtime. Drethani kept his voice flat, procedural. He asked the communications division for a status report on human diplomatic channels. The answer came from a small Orethi technician whose 4 fingers trembled slightly over her data tablet. Every channel was dark, not malfunctioning, not damaged, deliberately severed. All 12 embassies, all trade consulates, all science exchanges, every military liaison office humanity maintained in Council space, shut down within a 6-minute window. The quantum-entangled relays that connected human space to the galactic communications grid had been desynced. Not broken, desynced. The difference mattered. Breaking a relay was an accident or an attack. Desyncing one required authorization codes from the highest level of human government, and a coordinated technical operation across dozens of light years, executed with a precision that made the Orethi technician's voice go thin and careful as she described it. 6 minutes, all of it, gone. The chamber was quiet in a way Drethani had not heard in a very long time. Not the quiet of agreement or contemplation. The quiet of 12 species realizing simultaneously that none of them had a protocol for this. The Salvari ambassador spoke first, because the Salvari always spoke first. Kriel suggested the humans were posturing, a negotiation tactic. They wanted something, better trade terms, a council seat upgrade, some symbolic concession their young species could parade before their domestic audience. She'd seen it before. Let them stew. They'd come back when they got hungry. A few delegates murmured agreement. It fit the shape of the council's understanding of humanity. Energetic, emotional, prone to drama, ultimately dependent on galactic infrastructure they couldn't replicate alone. A tantrum, nothing more. Drethani ordered a formal message drafted, polite, measured, requesting clarification on the status of human diplomatic operations and expressing the Council's hope for continued partnership. Standard language, the kind of words that meant nothing and everything, the diplomatic equivalent of knocking on a neighbor's door to make sure they weren't dead. The message was transmitted through 3 separate backup channels, routed through relay stations the humans had helped build. It bounced. All 3 copies returned undeliverable. Not rejected, that would imply someone on the other end had read it and said no. Returned. The human systems weren't refusing communication. They had simply stopped being there. The address didn't exist anymore. It was like mailing a letter to a house that had been razed to the foundation while you weren't looking. Drethany dismissed the session. He gave no instructions. He made no statements. The delegates filed out in clusters, their translators buzzing with whispered speculation, and he stood alone in the chamber as the atmospheric system cycled and the lights dimmed to standby. He walked to the human delegation's row. 5 chairs. Standard galactic design, adjusted for the human frame, slightly narrower, slightly taller, the lumbar support modified, because humans apparently had spines that betrayed them if they sat wrong for too long. Danny Kowalski had complained about the chairs for years, said they were designed by someone who'd never met a back. Maggie had just brought a cushion from Earth and ignored the issue entirely. There was a coffee stain on the edge of the console desk. Small, brown, the ring-shaped ghost of a mug set down in a hurry. It had to be. Danny drank his black and careful. Maggie drank hers like someone was about to steal it. Drethany looked at the stain for a long time, longer than made sense. His secondary eyes, the smaller pair that tracked peripheral movement, kept drifting back to it, even when his primary gaze moved to the dark screens, the silent earpieces, the empty chairs that still held the faint thermal impressions of bodies that had not sat in them for 11 days. Nobody had cleaned the stain. It bothered him in a way he could not name and did not want to examine. 3 light-years away, aboard the diplomatic carrier Pale Horse, Maggie Dunn sat in the communications bay and watched the bounce notification appear on her screen. She read the sender tag, Valeth Prime, Office of the Senior Arbiter, and deleted it without opening it. She looked at Danny, who sat across from her in a chair that fit him no better than the ones on the station. He was staring at nothing. He'd been doing that a lot. "Coffee?" she said. No. She got up and made him one anyway, set it on the console next to his elbow. He didn't reach for it. The ship hummed around them, the particular low-frequency vibration of a vessel running quiet through empty space, going nowhere in particular, at a speed that suggested it had somewhere very specific to not be. Behind them, through the observation port, the stars of Council space glittered, in the arrangement Danny had spent 20 years learning to navigate. Which system belonged to which species, which trade lanes ran where, which clusters of light represented allies, and which represented obligations he'd mistaken for friendships. Neither of them looked back. 6 weeks before the silence, Nate Calloway hadn't slept in 31 hours, and his coffee tasted like it knew. He sat in a secure briefing room 4 floors beneath the old UN complex in Geneva, a place built during an era when humans still thought their biggest problems were each other. The walls were concrete and old metal, and hummed faintly with the kind of electromagnetic shielding that made your fillings ache if you had the wrong dental work. Nate had the wrong dental work. He'd been meaning to fix it for 3 years. He was always meaning to fix things. Across the table, Tara Quinn was pulling apart a data projection with her bare hands, fingers dragging through holographic Torvan script like a woman sorting laundry she hated. Tara was 34, built like a distance runner, and had the particular kind of calm that came from spending a decade translating languages invented by species who experienced time as a texture. Nate had once watched her decode an alien distress signal while eating a sandwich. She didn't even put the sandwich down. She wasn't calm now. It was riding piggyback on routine Torvan trade telemetry, she said, not looking up. Buried in the metadata layer, encrypted with a cipher that uses mathematical concepts we don't have words for yet. Took my team 9 days to crack. And, Nate said. Tara stopped moving. Her hands hung in the holographic light, fingers still spread, and she looked at him the way a doctor looks at you before they tell you something that changes the architecture of your life. It's a containment plan, she said. For us. The document was called the Veil Protocols. It had been authored jointly by 6 of the 12 council species: the Torvan, the Selvari, the Dreneth, the Cowlish, the Irventhi, and the Pale Reach Collective. 6 species, working in secret, for longer than humanity had been part of the galactic community. The document was comprehensive, in the way that a cage is comprehensive. Every bar placed with care, every gap measured, every angle considered. It laid out a 70-year roadmap. Phase 1. Ensure humans never achieved voting parity on the council by tying representation to a civilizational maturity index designed with metrics humanity could not meet for centuries. Phase 2. Deny independent jump gate access by making gate technology contingent on licensing agreements buried so deep in trade contracts that no human lawyer, and they had looked, Nate was sure now, they had looked, would find the clause until it was too late. Phase 3. Cap human naval tonnage through arms limitation treaties presented as mutual security agreements, calibrated so precisely that humanity's fleet would always be large enough to feel sovereign and never large enough to matter. And the trade deals. God, the trade deals. Every agreement humanity had negotiated in 60 years of council membership, every resource exchange, every technology transfer, every tariff reduction, Danny Kowalski and his predecessors had sweated and argued and celebrated over, was designed. Not negotiated, designed. The concessions were calculated. The wins were planned. The humans thought they were at a table. They were in a maze, and every turn they'd chosen had been the only turn available. Nate read the document twice. Then he called Pete Harmon. Pete arrived at 2 in the morning, which for a Secretary General of United Earth was practically a holiday. He was a quiet man, the kind of quiet that had weight to it, like a stone dropped in still water that somehow made no splash. He'd held the office for 6 years. In that time, Nate had heard him raise his voice exactly once, and the man on the receiving end had resigned within the hour. Pete sat down. Tara projected the Veil Protocols. Pete read. His face did nothing. His hands did nothing. He breathed the same way he always breathed, steady, slow, like a man who had decided a long time ago that urgency was a luxury he couldn't afford. He read it again. Then he said, "Leave the room. Everyone except Nate and Tara." The aides left. The security detail left. The door sealed with a sound like a coffin lid fitting into its groove. 40 minutes. Nate never told anyone what was said in those 40 minutes. Neither did Tara. What came out of that room was a decision, and the decision was silence. Not confrontation, not a demand for explanation. Not the leak of the protocols to Galactic media, which would have been the obvious play and the satisfying one, and exactly what the 6 guilty species would have been prepared to manage. No. Pete chose the thing nobody would expect, because it was the thing that couldn't be managed. He chose absence. Pull every ambassador. Close every consulate. Shut down every science exchange, every cultural program, every trade office. Desync the quantum relays. Do it fast. Do it clean. Do it in 6 minutes. And then, no statement, no explanation, no ultimatum. Let the silence be the message. Let them sit in a room with empty chairs and wonder. Tara asked him, "What happens when they come looking for answers?" Pete looked at her. He had the kind of eyes that made you feel like you were being read in a language you didn't speak. He didn't answer. 3 light years from Council space, 6 weeks later, Danny Kowalski sat aboard the Pale Horse and stared at the orders on his screen. He'd read them 4 times. The words hadn't changed. They weren't going to. Every human asset in Council space was to complete withdrawal within 90 hours. His 20 years of diplomatic work, every relationship, every late-night negotiation, every small trust built one handshake and one awkward cross-species dinner at a time, was to be packed into boxes and shipped home. He laughed. It wasn't a funny laugh. It was the laugh of a man who just discovered that the house he built was on someone else's land, and they'd let him build it because the house looked nice from their window. He was the pet who thought he was the guest. Every door that opened for him had been opened on purpose to lead him down a hall that went exactly where they wanted. Maggie sat across from him, watching. She didn't ask if he was okay. She knew the answer, and she knew he didn't want to say it. 90 hours, she said instead. 90 hours. That's tight. That's the point. She pulled up the logistics interface and began the withdrawal sequence. Embassy by embassy, consulate by consulate. 20 years of human presence in galactic civilization, dismantled in columns and rows on a screen. The staff reassignments alone were a nightmare. 400 people scattered across 12 systems, some of them with alien friends, alien colleagues, alien students they'd been teaching English to on Wednesday afternoons. Danny watched her work. After a while he said, "The Arethi kid, the one who gave me the crystal thing." Maggie's hand stopped. Lyra. Yeah. She's going to think we just left. We did just leave. She's 9, Maggie. Maggie didn't answer. Her hands started moving again. Embassy by embassy. The screen glowed in the dim cabin, lists scrolling upward, names and postings and years of service dissolving into transfer orders. Danny picked up his coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway, because cold coffee was still coffee, and some habits are the only honest things you have left when everything else turns out to have been a script someone else wrote for you. The pale horse drifted through the dark between stars, carrying 2 people and 400 transfer orders, and the kind of quiet that isn't silence, but something heavier. The quiet of people who know something terrible and can't unknow it. The quiet of a door that only locks from one side, and they were on the side that chose to turn the key. Behind them, the stars of Council space burned the way they always had. They didn't look any different. That was the worst part. 22 days into the silence, the Galactic Council sent a ship. It was a Torvan diplomatic cruiser, long, elegant, built from the pale bioceramic that the Torvan grew rather than manufactured. It moved through space the way Torvan moved through rooms, with the effortless grace of a species that had never once doubted it belonged wherever it was. Drethani had selected the vessel personally. He'd chosen the captain personally. He'd written the greeting script personally, in 3 languages, calibrated to be warm without being desperate, firm without being threatening, and open to negotiation without appearing to need one. The ship reached the Sol system border in 9 days. The humans were already there. A single frigate sat at the boundary marker, a compact, sharp-angled thing with hull plating that looked like it had been designed by someone who considered beauty a waste of metal. Its name, painted on the starboard bow in plain white letters, was the Betty White. The Torvan captain stared at the name for 6 seconds, consulted the cultural database, and found an entry about a human entertainer who had been beloved for her warmth and persistence. The captain did not find this reassuring. The Betty White transmitted a single automated message. No voice, no video, just text on a screen in standardized galactic trade script. Human space is closed to non-human vessels. No exceptions, no timeline for review. The Torvan captain requested clarification. He transmitted credentials. He invoked Drethani's authority. He offered to wait while the message was relayed to human leadership. The Betty White did not respond. It sat there, weapons dormant but uncovered, running warm enough that the Torvan sensors could read its energy signature like a heartbeat. Not attacking, not retreating, not negotiating, just present. A wall made of silence and hull plating and one very pointed name. The Torvan cruiser waited for 4 hours. Then it turned around. Back on Valeth Prime, the chamber fractured. It started in the corridors, not the formal sessions. Whispered conversations between delegates who had noticed something the public record didn't show. The 6 species who had not been part of the Veil protocols, the Orathi, the Rythkai, the Sendal, the Vorith, the Hollow Choir, and the Deep Lattice, had spent 60 years watching the Council make decisions about humanity, and assuming those decisions were collective. They were discovering now, in the slow and ugly way that trust dies, that they had been excluded from conversations that shaped the fate of a species. Liaison Commander Olen of the Rythkai was the first to say it out loud. He said it in a private meeting with the Orethi and Sendal ambassadors, in a room that wasn't on any official schedule, using a frequency his own intelligence service had swept for surveillance 3 times. Olen was tall, even by Rythkai standards, a species that looked like someone had built a diplomat out of dark wood and wire, and forgot to add softness. His neck frills, which in his species communicated emotion more honestly than words ever could, were flat and tight against his skull. If they did this to the humans, he said, they can do it to any of us. Nobody argued. That was how Olen knew he was right. He began building a coalition, quietly. Not for humanity's sake. Olen had no particular affection for humans, who he found loud and sentimental and bizarrely attached to a hot brown liquid they consumed at all hours. He was doing it for the Rythkai, for the Orethi, for every species that had sat in the council chamber and voted on resolutions without knowing that half the room had already decided the outcome in a meeting they weren't invited to. Kriel watched this happen and could do nothing to stop it. She tried. She held the protocol block together through 3 emergency sessions, arguing with the controlled precision of a predator who had learned to wear diplomatic clothes. The containment plan was prudent, she said. Necessary. Humans expanded too fast. They innovated without caution. They adapted to alien environments with a speed that bordered on biological aggression. In 2 generations they had gone from a single planet species to a civilization spread across 40 systems, learning languages and technologies and customs at a rate that no species in Council history had matched. They needed guardrails. Every responsible civilization needed guardrails for its newest members. The Veil protocols weren't hostility. They were parenting. The argument had weight. It even had logic. But it had a crack in it now, and the crack was this. The guardrails didn't work. The humans hadn't broken through the containment. They hadn't fought it or even noticed it, as far as anyone could tell. They had simply left. Cleanly. Completely. In 6 minutes. The species that the Veil protocols described as lacking civilizational maturity had executed a coordinated withdrawal across 12 star systems with a precision that made the Torvan intelligence service look like amateurs. And they had done it without telling anyone, without threatening anyone, without asking for anything. That was the part that frightened Kriel, though she would sooner swallow her own teeth than admit it. The humans didn't demand a seat at the table. They didn't flip the table. They built their own door and walked through it, and the sound of it closing was the loudest thing the council had ever heard. Drethani made a second attempt. This time he sent the Orethi, a neutral species, gentle by reputation, built like soft-edged stones with too many eyes and a cultural commitment to non-violence so deep it was encoded in their biology. Their envoy carried no weapons. It broadcast open-frequency peace signals from the moment it left Valeth Prime. It was, by every metric of galactic diplomacy, the least threatening thing anyone could send. It reached the Sol border and met the same automated message. Human space is closed to non-human vessels. No timeline for review. But this time, 5 seconds after the automated reply, a secondary transmission came through. Short, unencrypted, tagged with a diplomatic signature the Arethi envoy's captain recognized. Danny Kowalski, former human ambassador to the Galactic Council. The message was brief. We know about the Veil protocols, all of them. Tell Drethani the next conversation will be on our terms, or it won't happen at all. The Arethi captain transmitted the message to Valith Prime. It arrived during a council session. Drethani read it on his private screen, his primary eyes tracking the words, while his secondary pair, the smaller set that moved on their own, the ones that betrayed emotions that Torvan considered beneath their dignity, darted to the empty human seats across the chamber. He ended the session early, citing procedural reasons, and the delegates filed out with the buzzing, restless energy of people who knew they were being lied to, but hadn't decided yet what to do about it. The chamber emptied, the lights dimmed. The atmospheric systems cycled through their evening routine, scrubbing the air of 12 species worth of breath and sweat and pheromones. Drethani walked to the human delegation's row. The 5 chairs sat in their line. The console screens were dark. The translation earpieces rested in their crooked cradles. And there, on the edge of the desk, the coffee stain, still there, 22 days old now, a small brown ring on a surface that self-cleaning protocols should have dissolved in hours. Someone had turned the cleaning cycle off for this section. Drethani didn't know who. He hadn't ordered it. He stood there for a long time. His 4 hands rested on the dormant console, fingers spread across a surface that still held the faintest trace of human warmth. Not real warmth, not after 22 days, but the memory of warmth, the idea of it, the way a room remembers the people who used to fill it, even after they're gone. The stain remained. He did not clean it. 40 days in, the numbers started biting. Beth Morales sat in Pete Harmon's office on Earth, a room that looked nothing like what people imagined the leader of United Earth worked in, because Pete had refused every renovation, and it still had the carpet from 2089, a shade of gray that had given up trying to be blue, and laid out the figures with the careful precision of a woman delivering bad news to someone who didn't tolerate soft language. Valithium reserves are at 11%, she said, down from 38 at the start of the withdrawal. The colony on Kepler 442b is rationing energy already. 2 more months, and they're choosing between heating and communications. Pete sat behind a desk that was too small for the office and too large for the man. He was reading something on a tablet that wasn't what Beth was talking about, which was his way of listening harder than anyone else in the room. And the gate drives, he said. Maybe 6 if we stretch maintenance cycles. After that, we lose reliable interstellar transit between the outer colonies. So we're bleeding. We are bleeding, Beth confirmed. She did not add the word sir because Pete had asked her not to on her first day, and Beth Morales was a woman who only needed to be told things once. Pete set the tablet down. He looked at Beth the way he looked at everyone who brought him hard truths, with something that wasn't gratitude exactly, but lived in the same neighborhood. How's the other side? He asked. Beth almost smiled. Almost. Worse, she said. It turned out that humanity in 60 years of enthusiastic galactic citizenship had made itself into something no one fully appreciated until it was gone. Not a superpower. Not a threat. Something stranger, and as the Council was learning, far more dangerous. A habit. Humans brokered. That was the thing. They brokered between species that considered direct communication with certain other species to be somewhere between distasteful and biologically impossible. The Selvari and the Rithkai hadn't spoken face-to-face in 3 centuries. They didn't need to. There was always a human in the middle, translating not just language, but intention, smoothing the gaps that no universal translator could bridge, because the gaps weren't linguistic. They were cultural, historical, personal. Danny Kowalski had spent 7 years managing the Selvari-Rithkai trade corridor, and both sides thought they were getting the better deal. That was Danny's gift. He made everyone feel like they'd won. Danny was on Titan Station now, packing boxes. Human shipping firms had handled 40% of cross-species freight. Not because human ships were faster or cheaper, but because human crews learned everybody's docking protocols. Every species had different standards, different airlock sizes, different atmospheric requirements, different ideas about which direction was up on a loading bay. Most species learned their own system and expected everyone else to adapt. Humans learned all of them. It wasn't strategic. It was just the way humans worked. Show up, figure out the local rules, make it work, complain about it later over drinks. Those shipping lanes were empty now. 3 council homeworlds were reporting supply chain failures. The Selvari Agricultural Exchange, a system that moved food across 4 star systems and fed 2 billion beings, had ground to a crawl because the logistics coordinators who kept it running were human, and the humans were gone. Kriel was getting emergency calls from her own government. The irony was perfect and terrible. The species she had argued needed to be contained was the one holding her civilization's grocery system together. On Titan Station, the withdrawal was a slow, ugly thing. Danny and Maggie worked 18-hour days processing the human exodus from galactic space. It wasn't dramatic. It was paperwork and cargo manifests and arguments about shipping weight. And a woman from the Orethi Cultural Exchange Program who cried when she found out her human teaching partner had already left without saying goodbye. Maggie handled the logistics. Danny handled the people. This was how they'd always worked. And it was the last time they would work this way in a place that still smelled faintly of alien air and recycled starlight. One afternoon, Maggie spent 3 hours boxing up Danny's office. 20 years of diplomatic life, reduced to containers. Carved stones from the Rithkai, a traditional gift for trusted outsiders, each one shaped to fit the palm of the recipient's hand. Woven fabric from the sendal that changed color with the holder's body temperature. A ceremonial drinking vessel from the Drenith that Danny had never used because it was technically meant for a liquid that was mildly toxic to humans. But he kept it on his desk because the Drenith ambassador had made it herself. And a crystal figurine, small, slightly lopsided, made by an Orethi child named Lyra, who was 9 years old and had given it to Danny after he'd spent an afternoon teaching her to throw a baseball, which she was terrible at and loved. Maggie put the figurine in the box. Danny said, "Leave the box open." She closed it. He didn't argue. There was nothing to argue about. The box was a box. The figurine was a figurine. And 9-year-old Lyra was somewhere on an Orethi homeworld, thinking that the tall human who taught her to throw had walked away without a word, which was true in every way that mattered, and wrong in every way that hurt. 3 light years away, on the Sol system border, Captain Eddie Voss sat in the command chair of the Betty White and watched the same Torvan cruiser he'd been watching for 6 straight days do absolutely nothing on his sensor display. Eddie was 29, from a town in Kansas that no longer existed because it had been absorbed into a farming cooperative that no longer existed because the land had been converted to a launch facility that did exist but that Eddie hadn't visited since he was 12. He had joined the Navy because he liked ships. Standoffs were just staring contests with worse lighting, and Eddie had never won a staring contest in his life. His comms officer interrupted his 6th hour of doing nothing with something that was not nothing. A transmission, not from the Torvan, from a Rithkai personal frequency, unregistered, heavily encrypted, routed through 3 neutral relay stations to avoid Council surveillance. The sender identified himself as Liaison Commander Olen. Olen wanted to talk, not through the Council, not through official channels. He was offering information, The full unredacted Veil protocols, plus internal council communications showing exactly which species had pushed hardest for human containment, who had voted for what, and when. Everything. In exchange, he wanted one thing: assurance that when the silence ended, because Olen was smart enough to know it would end, one way or another, the 6 species who had nothing to do with the Veil protocols would not be punished for something they did not do. Eddie read the message twice, then he routed it up the chain with a priority tag, and went back to watching the Torvon cruiser not move. The message reached Nate Calloway at 3 in the morning, Geneva time. Nate read it, swore once with great feeling, and called Pete. Pete read Olen's offer in his small office with the bad carpet. He read it the way he read everything, slowly, completely, with the patience of a man who understood that decisions made at 3 in the morning shaped centuries. Beth Morales sat in the corner, pretending she wasn't watching. When Pete finished, he set the tablet down and asked a question nobody in the room expected. "What do the Orethi think?" Nate blinked. "The Orethi?" "The Orethi," Pete repeated. "The ones who said the peace envoy. What do they think about all this?" It was the first time in 40 days that Pete Harmon had asked about anyone who wasn't human. Beth watched his face. She saw something move behind his eyes. Not softness, not weakness, nothing so simple. More like a door opening that he'd kept closed on purpose, because closing it was necessary, and keeping it closed was the job. But doors don't like being closed, even the ones you lock yourself. Nate said he'd find out. Pete nodded. He read Olen's message one more time. Then he set it down and looked out the window at a sky that held more stars than anyone could count. Each one a system where someone was dealing with the consequences of a silence he had chosen. The carpet was still gray. The office was still small. The weight of quiet pressed against the walls like water behind a dam, and Pete Harmon sat in the center of it, holding everything shut with nothing but stillness and the hope that stillness would be enough. The Koreth waypoint had been dead for 600 years. It hung in deep space between 3 systems that no longer had names. A station built by a species that had joined the council, contributed greatly, and then quietly ceased to exist in the way that civilizations sometimes do, not with war or catastrophe, but with a slow forgetting, like a word on the tip of a tongue that never quite arrives. The waypoint was their last artifact, a meeting place, neutral ground, built for conversations that couldn't happen anywhere else. Human engineers reactivated it in 4 days. They repressurized the chambers, patched the hull, jury-rigged the atmospheric systems with hardware from 3 different species, and powered the whole thing with a portable reactor that Pete Harmon's ship carried in its cargo bay. When the Torvon advance team arrived to inspect the site, they found the station functional, heated, and this was the detail that Drethani would think about for years afterward, stocked with coffee. Not as a gesture, not as diplomacy. The humans just couldn't work without it. Pete arrived on a single ship, no escort, no fleet visible on long-range sensors, though every species in the galaxy understood that not visible and not present were different concepts when dealing with a civilization that had disappeared from 12 star systems in 6 minutes. He brought Danny Kowalski as ambassador, Maggie Dunn as operations lead, and Nate Calloway as intelligence advisor. 4 people. That was the entire human delegation for the most important diplomatic meeting in 60 years. Danny wore a suit. It still fit wrong. It had always fit wrong. 20 years of representing his species to the galaxy, and he'd never found a suit that didn't make him feel like a kid borrowing his father's clothes. Drethani arrived with a delegation of 11, 1 representative from each species that had agreed to attend. Kriel was there because she had no choice. Olen was there because he had made sure of it. The Orethi sent their eldest diplomat, a being named Saveth, who moved like a stone that had learned to be gentle, and who had 4 more eyes than anyone needed, but used every single one. The chamber was round. The humans had set it up that way. No head of the table, no elevated seats, no position of authority. Just a circle. Maggie's execution. Pete opened the meeting. He did it with a gesture that no one in the room expected, least of all Danny, who had worked with Pete for 6 years and still couldn't predict the man the way you can't predict weather on a planet with 3 suns. He projected the Veil protocols, the full document, unredacted, every page visible to every delegate, floating in the center of the room in holographic light that made the alien script glow like something holy and terrible at the same time. The 6 non-protocol species saw the complete document for the first time. Olen's neck frills went flat. Savet's many eyes tracked back and forth across the text with the steady, relentless pace of someone reading their own betrayal in a language they understood perfectly. Pete didn't read the military section. He didn't read the trade manipulation or the naval tonnage caps or the 70-year containment timeline. He read one line, written in Drethani's own diplomatic voice, in the formal Torvon register reserved for statements of civilizational truth. The human species, while energetic and resourceful, lacks the civilizational maturity to participate as equal partners in galactic governance. Pete let the words hang in the round room. He did not argue with them. He did not slam his fist, or raise his voice, or do any of the things that the Council expected from the emotional, dramatic species they had been managing for 6 decades. He just stood there, a tired man in a room full of beings who could break him in half, and let the silence do the work. Then he said, "You wrote that 60 years ago. I want to know if you still believe it." The room was quiet. Drethani sat across the circle. All 4 hands rested on the table. His primary eyes held Pete's gaze with the steadiness of a species that had been conducting diplomacy since before humans discovered fire. His secondary eyes, the small ones, the ones that moved on their own, the ones that his species considered it shameful to acknowledge because they showed what the primary eyes worked so hard to hide, were fixed on the empty space beside Pete, where, in another timeline, a coffee-stained console desk sat in a chamber 3 light-years away. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that Kriel shifted in her seat, long enough that Olen's frills started to rise, long enough that Maggie, standing behind Pete, began mentally drafting the withdrawal to permanent isolation protocol she'd been told to prepare as a contingency. Then Drethani said 3 words that had never been spoken by a sitting senior arbiter of the Galactic Council in 400 years of recorded history. "I was wrong." Kriel's head turned. Not fast. The slow, controlled rotation of a predator who has just heard a sound from a direction that should be safe. Her silver fur lay flat against her skull. Drethani did not look at her. He looked at Pete. "I was wrong," he said again, "and the document behind you is the proof of how wrong I was. Not because your species found it, because your species responded to it with more maturity than the 6 who wrote it." The negotiation that followed took 11 hours. It was not dramatic. It was not inspiring. It was 200 beings arguing about voting formulas and gate access licensing and treaty dissolution timelines, and the specific legal mechanism by which the Veil protocols would be disclosed to every species in the Council. Not as punishment, Pete insisted, but as precedent. If it happened once in secret, it could happen again. The only protection was sunlight, and sunlight doesn't care what species you are. Kriel fought every point. She fought with the precision and stamina of someone who knew she was losing, and had decided that losing slowly was better than losing fast. She conceded independent jump gate access after 4 hours. She conceded voting parity on a 12-year timeline after 7. She conceded full protocol disclosure after 9, when the non-protocol faction voted as a bloc and the math became a wall she could not climb. Olen watched from his observer's seat. He did not gloat. His frills stayed flat and careful. He looked like a man watching a building come down and calculating whether the rubble would reach his feet. At hour 11, Pete called a break. The delegates dispersed into the station's corridors, which the humans had stocked with appropriate atmospheric zones for each species. And, this detail again, this absurd, stubborn human detail, refreshments. Someone had researched the dietary preferences of all 12 species. Someone had found or synthesized appropriate food and drink. Someone had labeled everything in 4 languages with allergy warnings. It was Maggie. Of course it was Maggie. Danny found the observation deck, alone. It was a small room at the top of the station, with a curved window that faced nothing. No stars of consequence, no planets, no landmarks. Just the deep black of interstellar space, the emptiest address in the universe. He still wore the suit. He'd loosened the collar somewhere around hour 6, and never fixed it. His hands hung at his sides. He was 53 years old, and he'd spent 20 of those years in rooms where he didn't quite fit, speaking languages that weren't quite his, building something he thought was real. It was real. That was the part that ached. The friendships were real. The late-night conversations with delegates who told him things they shouldn't have. The meals shared with aliens who laughed at his jokes, even when the translation mangled the punchline. Lyra's crystal figurine, lopsided and perfect, all of it real. And all of it built on a foundation that 6 species had designed to crumble the moment humans got too comfortable. Maggie found him there. She always found him. It was her secondary function, logistics first, finding Danny second, keeping Danny from staring into voids third. She set a coffee on the railing beside him. It was warm. She'd made it exactly the way he liked it, which was to say, she'd made it the way she liked it, because Danny had never once told her how he actually took his coffee, and at this point, it was too late to correct the record. He picked it up, held it, didn't drink. "We going back?" she said. He looked at the stars, the ones he'd spent 20 years learning, the trade lanes and territorial markers, and the particular cluster of light that meant Orethi space, where a 9-year-old girl with too many eyes and a terrible throwing arm was probably wondering what she'd done wrong. She hadn't done anything wrong. She'd just been born into a galaxy where the adults couldn't be trusted with their own rules. "Yeah," Danny said. "Different this time, though." "How different?" He was quiet. The coffee warmed his hands, but he didn't lift it to his mouth. Below the observation deck, the station hummed with the sound of 12 species navigating the wreckage of trust, and finding, among the broken pieces, the rough shape of something that might hold weight if they were careful, if they were honest, if they were better than they'd been. "The kind of different where they know we can leave," he said. Maggie stood beside him. She didn't touch his shoulder, or say something comforting, or tell him it would be okay, because Maggie Dunn had never once in her life promised something she couldn't deliver. She just stood there, in the quiet, in the dark, in the space between what was and what might be, and let the silence, for the first time in 61 days, be something other than a weapon. Below them, the Koreth waypoint turned slowly in the void, alive again after 600 years, lit from within by the borrowed light of species who had come here to do the hardest thing any civilization can do, not to win, to go back.